Good evening, everyone. I'm Miguel Dejesus, and today I'll be presenting information on the Reverend Dr. Arthur C. McGiffert, dates 1861 to 1933, Presbyterian and Congregational minister and president of the Union Theological Seminary during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But first, in accordance with Liberty University's History Department requirements regarding worldview statements, according to course guidelines, historians must be objective and honest in their investigations. A quick background on Dr. McGiffert: he received his bachelor's and master's degrees at Western Reserve University and subsequently received his PhD at the University of Marburg in Germany. In 1888, he returned to the United States and was ordained by the Presbyterian Church, and by 1893, he was teaching church history at the Union Theological Seminary in New York. Though a Presbyterian minister, it was well known that he had a modernistic approach to biblical theology and publicly admitted his scholarly criticism of certain institutions and traditions in Christian doctrine. He has a long list of notable and published works to his credit, some of which were viewed as highly controversial. One of these books was A History of Christian in the Apostolic Age, published in 1897. Several issues that the Presbyterian General Assembly had with this publication was, one, that he indicated that historical change makes all religious teaching relative, and that there is no continuing essence of Christian history. I believe what he was alluding to with this was that it's the historian's duty to view historical information through the lens of the time that it was written, vice the time that it's interpreted, as that time has historically changed and can bias a historian's interpretation. Failure to do this could subsequently alter the way the biblical doctrine is taught or accepted. Another issue was that the development of Christianity as a religion had less to do with Jesus Christ, who himself was Jewish, and more to do with Paul, who led the breakaway of Christianity from Judaism. Also, another issue was that he denies the divine institution of the Lord's Supper. He identifies it as a sacrificial characteristic in his final night, vice the memorial characteristics that were set forth by Paul. And finally, the last accusation was that he did not believe and the inerrancy of the Bible. The Presbyterian General Assembly advised him to reform his views after the publication of this book, but he refused. Subsequently, charges were brought forth of heresy, such as they were with Charles Briggs just a couple years before. In a Washington Post article dated February 15th of 1898, Reverend Dr. Walter D. Buchanan, a moderator of the New York Presbytery overseeing the charges, said, and I paraphrase, "If Dr. McGiffert's book contains the passage to which my attention has been directed, he is out of touch, not in harmony with the standards of our church, and should separate himself from us." In April of 1898, in an issue of the American Historical Review Journal, in a review of his book, Edwin Knox Mitchell states, "Professor McGiffert, so far as we have observed, does not even allude to these birth stories regarding the Immaculate Conception, presumably because he believes them to be wholly legendary." During the buildup of the heresy trial, McGiffert's own lawyer, who was also his brother, argued that the history of Christianity in the Apostolic Age was written for scholars who wouldn't misunderstand certain excerpts from that book when taken out of context, and who could interpret the criticism not as a challenge on Christian religion, but as a criticism of the historical interpretation of the recordings of those divinely inspired by the experiences with Jesus. His heresy trial was voted against ultimately. However, 2 years later, in 1900, the charge was revisited, and also along with the charge of contempt for the Presbyterian General Assembly. Rather than go through a heresy trial, McGiffert wanted his beloved Presbyterian Church to move on without the embarrassment, so he withdrew and was almost eagerly awaited by the Congregational Church. Despite the public controversies that he faced, he retained his position at the Union Theological Seminary until 1927, subsequently rising to become its 8th president. Upon his death in 1933, theologians and academics from all over the country turned out at his funeral in honor of him to serve as his pallbearers. In conclusion, at the end of the day, McGiffert was still a Christian and a believer in the majority of Christian fundamentals. He only questioned certain elements inducted into Christian doctrine and sought to explain how these elements came to be, and whether or not these elements were correct in their interpretation. At the end of the day, he did what any good historian should do.